Welcome to Day 66 on the Trail. We have 5 readings for today, from Acts 15 verses 1 through 35, Exodus 38 verse 21 through 39 verse 43, Proverbs chapter 3 verses 13 through 20, the 71st Psalm, and the Wisdom of Solomon chapter 16 verses 15 through 29. When we discussed Acts 10 and 11, we mentioned that the story of Peter and Cornelius formed a critical backdrop to the first decision that was made by the church regarding the inclusion of the Gentiles. Today, we will discuss not just the decision that was made by the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, but the process by which that decision was made. Now, as a reminder of the events of Acts 10, we had an outsider, Cornelius, and an insider, Peter, who were each given a partial message from God. First, God sends Cornelius to get Peter from Joppa. At the same time, Peter has a confusing and uncertain vision about eating unclean food. Upon the arrival of the messengers from Cornelius, Peter travels with some friends to visit the household of Cornelius, a Gentile. Upon meeting Cornelius, Peter begins to understand, at some level, that his vision about unclean food and this visit to the Gentiles, who were also considered unclean, were related. Then, once Peter shares the message of Jesus with the household of Cornelius, the Spirit of God shows up in a powerful and unmistakable way. When this happens, the Gentiles receive the Spirit, just as the Jewish Christians had on the day of Pentecost, and Peter realizes that God is saving the Gentiles. This one experience starts to spread. God is moving powerfully in the Gentile regions, as we saw in the first missionary journey of Paul and Barnabas in Acts 13 and 14. However, the inclusion of the Gentiles creates a new set of questions for the early church. Questions of identity and boundaries. Questions like, who is included in the kingdom? What is required to be included as part of the family of believers? How will the boundaries change? And who are we if they are a part of we? So we find this as Acts 15 opens. Then certain individuals came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. This is not an irrelevant or exclusionary question. They are Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. What then will be the place of Torah, the Jewish law, for the followers of Jesus? Here's the core question that lies at the heart of their debate. Do the Gentiles have to change and become like the Jewish believers to be accepted by God? Or do the Jewish believers have to move, to change their perspective, to associate with Gentile believers? In short, what will it mean to be a Christian? Now, regarding circumcision in particular, the Jerusalem Council decided that this would not be a requirement to be a disciple of Jesus or member of the church. However, like I said earlier, I believe the process by which this decision was made is of far more interest to us than the outcome of the decision itself. That is, how did the earliest Christians make difficult decisions as a community? Our story continues in verse 2. And after Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them, Paul and Barnabas and some of the other believers were appointed to go up to Jerusalem to discuss this question with the apostles and the elders. First, we learn that Paul and Barnabas were upset that some Jewish Christian leaders were requiring the Gentiles to be circumcised. In fact, we are told that they had no small debate. That is, this was not a small or insignificant argument. Notice that the earliest Christians did not shy away from talking about conflict, even a very difficult conflict. And they were not embarrassed by it, because we are told about it over several chapters in Acts. Due to this growing conflict, Paul and Barnabas are sent by the Gentile churches to Jerusalem to share what God was doing among them. quite simply, to tell their story. When Paul and Barnabas arrive, notice that they are not received with hostility or anger. In Acts 15, verse 4, it says, "When they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they reported all that God had done with them." They were welcomed by the church. There was an atmosphere of hospitality, even when preparing for a debate. And Paul and Barnabas are given an opportunity to tell God's story among the Gentiles. Also, Peter tells his story, the story of his encounter with Cornelius. We see here that the first part of the decision-making process for the earliest Christians was taking time to listen to the story of what God had been doing among them. After they had shared their stories, James stands up and looks to the scriptures for direction, specifically from the book of Amos. The prophet Amos talked about how one day God would bring all nations to Jerusalem, and they would be called God's people together. Therefore, if their experience of God, as seen in their shared stories, and the witness of Scripture are in agreement, what is the next step? How should they respond? Beginning in verse 19, James outlines the decision made by the Jerusalem Council. "Therefore I have reached the decision that we should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God, but we should write to them to abstain only from things polluted by idols, and from fornication, and from whatever has been strangled, and from blood. For in every city, for generations past, Moses has had those who proclaim him, for he has been read aloud every Sabbath in the synagogues." When we look at the final decision, we quickly notice that 3 of the 4 instructions are related to food. Perhaps the compromise was designed to allow the Jewish and Gentile Christians to share one table. In essence, there will not be 2 churches, a Gentile church and a Jewish church, but only one church. One church that could eat together and share life together. One church founded on the message and continuing life of Jesus. And, if you recall, how did this whole debate start? Peter, on the roof, trying to figure out if his vision about unclean food meant something more. And it did. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.